A health insurance manager denies a black woman's application, even though she fills all of the requirements. She is shocked when she discovers his hidden racist agenda. Sick of the blatant racism that has followed her all her life, she vows to get revenge, not just for herself, but for everyone who has been wronged. The sleek, polished floors of Horizon Insurance's office gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, a stark contrast to the nervous energy coursing through Naomi Carter. She clutched her neatly organized folder tightly, her palms slightly damp, and drew in a deep breath. Her heartbeat thudded in her ears as she approached the receptionist's desk. "I'm here for my appointment with Mr. Reynolds," she said, her voice steady despite the unease gnawing at her. The receptionist, a young woman with a tight bun and a sharper stare, glanced up from her computer. "Name? Naomi Carter." The receptionist scanned her screen and nodded curtly, motioning to a row of leather chairs by the wall. "Take a seat. He'll call you shortly." Naomi thanked her and sat down, surveying the office. The room felt sterile and impersonal, the kind of place designed to intimidate rather than comfort. She mentally rehearsed her points. She had triple-checked her application. Everything was in order. There was no reason to worry. Yet, the stories she'd heard about subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination gnawed at her resolve. "Ms. Carter?" Naomi looked up to see a man standing in the doorway, his tailored suit pristine, his smile paper-thin. Ethan Reynolds. She rose, gripping her folder, and followed him into his office. The space was equally cold, with walls adorned by bland corporate artwork. Ethan gestured to the chair opposite his imposing desk, settling into his leather seat with a practiced air of authority. "So," he began, flipping through her file, his tone smooth but clipped, "I see you're applying for individual health insurance coverage. Why don't you start by telling me why you're here today?" Naomi straightened her back, her voice steady. "I was recently diagnosed with a chronic condition. I need coverage to manage my treatment and ensure I can stay healthy. I've reviewed the policy requirements, and I meet them all." Ethan's smile tightened. "We'll see about that." His tone set Naomi on edge, but she forced herself to remain composed. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her. The pleasantries were about to end. Naomi sat stiffly, her nails digging into the edges of the folder in her lap. Ethan Reynolds leaned back in his chair, exuding an air of smug authority as he flipped through the documents she had carefully prepared. His expression shifted subtly, half a smirk, half a sneer, and Naomi felt her stomach twist. "Well, Ms. Carter," he began, his voice silky and insincere, "it seems you've brought all the necessary paperwork. Proof of income, medical diagnosis, residency, all very thorough." "Thank you," Naomi replied, her tone cautious, sensing an undercurrent of disdain. Ethan set the papers down, clasping his hands in front of him. "But there are some concerns." He leaned slightly forward, his smirk growing sharper. "Your income. Freelance graphic design, is it? That's not exactly stable." Naomi's brow furrowed. "I've been freelancing for 5 years and have a steady client base. My income meets your requirements, as you can see from the tax returns I included." Ethan raised an eyebrow, feigning mild amusement. "Meets the requirements? Sure, on paper. But freelance work, as I'm sure you know, can be unpredictable. One bad month and, poof, you're behind on premiums." Naomi's jaw tightened, but she kept her tone measured. "That's why I've shown consistent income for several years. I've planned for unexpected situations." Ethan chuckled softly, shaking his head, as if her explanation were naive. "Planning doesn't account for everything, Ms. Carter. Chronic conditions can get expensive, and we have to think about the long-term impact on the system. You understand, don't you?" "No," Naomi replied firmly, leaning forward. "I don't understand. I've met every qualification your company requires. What exactly is the problem?" Ethan's smirk faltered for a split second before he plastered it back on. "The problem is that we have to assess applicants holistically. It's not just about ticking boxes. It's about ensuring the sustainability of our policies." "What does that even mean?" Naomi shot back, her frustration seeping into her voice. Are you saying I'm not sustainable? Based on what? Ethan leaned back again, spreading his arms wide. Based on experience. We've seen patterns, Ms. Carter. Applicants in situations like yours often pose a higher risk. We have to protect the integrity of the system. Naomi narrowed her eyes, her grip tightening on the folder. Situations like mine? Patterns? Be specific, Mr. Reynolds. Ethan hesitated, his smile freezing on his face. Let's not make this into something it's not, he said coolly. No, Naomi snapped, her voice rising slightly. Let's make it exactly what it is. You're using coded language to deny me coverage. Just say it outright. You think I'm a risk because I'm black. Ethan's smirk twisted into something nastier, his eyes narrowing. Now, that's a bold accusation, he said, his tone dripping with sarcasm. I don't appreciate being called a racist simply because you don't qualify for our policies. I do qualify, Naomi fired back, her voice steady but sharp. And we both know this isn't about qualifications. It's about your prejudice. Ethan scoffed, rolling his eyes. Oh, please, don't start playing the victim. This is about business, not whatever agenda you're trying to push. Agenda? Naomi repeated, incredulous. I'm here because I need health insurance, and I've done everything right. You're the one making it about something else. Ethan leaned forward, his voice dropping to a cold, condescending tone. Ms. Carter, we've seen this before. Applicants who think they can argue their way into a policy that isn't a good fit. People who end up costing more than they contribute. We're just trying to avoid a bad investment. A bad investment, Naomi said slowly, her voice thick with restrained anger. You're talking about me like I'm a number on a spreadsheet, not a person with a life, a condition that needs treatment, and a right to be treated fairly. Ethan shrugged. That's the reality of the insurance business. It's not personal. It is personal when your so-called reality is rooted in racism, Naomi said, her voice rising. You think you can hide behind business decisions, but what you're doing is wrong, and you know it. Ethan leaned back again, the smirk returning. Believe whatever helps you sleep at night, Ms. Carter, but the decision is final. This policy isn't for you. I'm not leaving until you give me a real answer, Naomi said firmly, her voice unwavering. You already have your answer, Ethan said, his tone clipped. Security can explain it to you further if necessary. Naomi didn't flinch. No, you explain it. Right here, right now. Why am I being denied when I've met every requirement? Ethan glared at her, his patience visibly thinning. You're being denied because I say so. That's all the explanation you're getting. Naomi locked eyes with him, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. And that's why I'm not leaving. Naomi sat rigid, her gaze locked on Ethan Reynolds as his expression soured further. The tension in the room was thick, but she refused to look away. The polished facade of professionalism he'd worn moments ago had slipped, replaced by a simmering hostility. Ethan leaned forward, his elbows on the desk. Let me explain something to you, Ms. Carter. I don't owe you an explanation. This isn't a negotiation. You don't meet our standards. End of story. Naomi's fists clenched in her lap, but her voice remained steady. I meet every standard your policy outlines. The only thing that doesn't meet your standards is me. And we both know why. Do we? Ethan asked, his tone mocking. Maybe the real problem here is that you can't accept reality. Not everyone gets what they want in life. Naomi sat forward, her voice calm but seething with anger. You're right. Not everyone gets what they deserve, especially when people like you are in charge. But I'm not going to sit here and let you dismiss me without justification. Ethan's smile twisted into something cruel. Justification? You want me to spell it out for you? Fine. You're not the kind of applicant we're looking for. Your profile screams liability. Financially, medically, and, frankly, professionally. I've seen this song and dance before, and I'm not interested in being part of the encore. Liability, Naomi echoed, her voice rising. You mean because I'm black, don't you? You're hiding behind vague excuses because you think you can get away with it. But this is discrimination. Plain and simple. Discrimination? Ethan laughed sharply, the sound grating. You think every denial is about race? How convenient. Maybe, Ms. Carter, you should take a good, hard look at your own situation instead of blaming others for your shortcomings. Naomi's breath quickened, but she held her ground. My only shortcoming is sitting here, thinking you'd treat me like any other applicant. But you can't even hide your racism behind your corporate jargon. You've already decided people like me aren't worth your time or resources. Ethan slapped his hand on the desk, the sound echoing in the room. Watch yourself, Ms. Carter. Accusing me of racism won't change the fact that this policy isn't for you. And frankly, your attitude is proving my point. My attitude? Naomi shot back, her voice steady but cutting. You've insulted me, denied me what I'm entitled to, and now you're blaming me for calling out your behavior? Do you even hear yourself? Ethan's face reddened, the veneer of control cracking. I don't have to listen to this nonsense. You're wasting my time and yours. Time I wouldn't have to waste if you did your job fairly. Naomi countered. She stood up, leaning slightly over the desk. You've made this personal. You could have processed my application like anyone else's, but instead, you decided to make it about me, who I am, what I look like. You're the problem here, not me. Ethan rose abruptly, his towering frame meant to intimidate. I think we're done here. No, we're not, Naomi said, her voice unwavering. I'm not leaving until you give me a real reason, one that isn't laced with your thinly veiled racism. Say it plainly, Mr. Reynolds. Why am I being denied? Ethan's glare was sharp enough to cut glass. You want it plainly? Fine. Applicants like you, black women, are always looking for a handout. You come in here with your sob stories and expect us to bend over backward. Well, not today. I've seen your type before, and I'm not buying it. Naomi's heart pounded, but she refused to look away. Her voice came out calm, each word slicing through the tension. That's exactly what I needed to hear. And that's why this conversation isn't over. Not here, not now, and not in court. Ethan scoffed, his smirk returning. Court? Do you have any idea who you're talking to? This company has lawyers who'd eat you alive before you even set foot in a courtroom. Naomi's eyes burned with resolve. We'll see about that. You might think you're untouchable, but people like you always think that, until they're not. Ethan stared at her for a long moment, his face a mixture of contempt and irritation. You've got guts, I'll give you that. But guts don't win lawsuits. Now, I suggest you leave before you embarrass yourself further. Naomi stayed where she was, her voice calm but firm. I'm not the one embarrassing myself, Mr. Reynolds. That's all you. Ethan opened his mouth to retort, but a knock at the door interrupted him. He glanced at the door, clearly agitated. We're not finished, he snapped toward the unseen interrupter, before turning back to Naomi. And neither are you, apparently. So let's see how much more of my time you plan to waste. Naomi crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. Until you do your job properly, I'm not going anywhere. Ethan's jaw clenched, his irritation now fully visible as Naomi remained seated, her unwavering gaze meeting his. He slammed his palm onto the desk, making her papers shift slightly from the impact. You've made your point, Ms. Carter, he barked. And let me make mine. You're wasting my time, and I'm done entertaining this charade. Get up, walk out that door, and save yourself the embarrassment. Naomi leaned forward, her voice low and cutting. Embarrassment? The only embarrassment here is you, Mr. Reynolds, sitting there, clinging to your authority, like it justifies the disgusting way you treat people. Do you even hear yourself? I don't need a lecture from someone who doesn't even understand how the real world works. Ethan shot back, his face reddening. You want a pity party? Go somewhere else. This is a business, and in this business, we don't reward sob stories. Naomi's blood boiled, but she forced herself to stay composed. You keep saying this isn't personal, but everything about your tone, your words, screams otherwise. You think I don't belong here, that I'm not worth your time. Well, you're wrong. Wrong, Ethan sneered, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Let me tell you something, Ms. Carter. People like you are the reason policies like ours have to exist in the first place. You want to play the victim. But the truth is, you've already lost. Naomi shot to her feet, her voice rising. No. The truth is, you've already lost. You've exposed yourself for exactly what you are. A racist, a coward, and a disgrace to your position. You think I'm going to sit here and take your abuse? Think again. Ethan straightened, towering over her. I don't have to listen to this, he spat, his voice cold and dismissive. He pressed a button on his desk, his gaze sharp as a knife. Moments later, 2 security guards entered the room, their presence an ominous backdrop to the escalating argument. Ethan gestured toward Naomi with a dismissive wave. Escort Ms. Carter out of the building. She's no longer welcome here. Naomi's heart raced, but she didn't flinch. Turning to the guards, she said, You're really going to drag me out for standing up for myself? Go ahead. Add more proof to the lawsuit I'm about to file. The guards hesitated, glancing at Ethan, whose face darkened further. Do your job, he snapped. One guard stepped forward, his voice soft but firm. Ma'am, we need you to leave. Naomi didn't move. This man is discriminating against me. You can carry me out if you want, but I'm not going quietly. Ethan crossed his arms, his smirk returning. See? This is exactly the problem. You people can't ever just let things go. Naomi's eyes burned with fury. And people like you can't ever seem to see what's right in front of you. Your days of getting away with this are over. The guards exchanged uneasy glances before one of them gently but firmly took Naomi by the arm. Please, ma'am. Naomi turned her glare on Ethan. I hope you enjoy the spotlight, Mr. Reynolds, because when this goes public, you're going to wish you'd thought twice before opening your mouth. Ethan chuckled darkly. Go ahead. Scream all you want. No one's going to care about your little crusade. As the guards escorted her toward the door, Naomi pulled her arm free and turned to face Ethan one last time. We'll see who no one cares about when you're the one packing up your desk. Ethan didn't respond, his face an unreadable mask as the door closed behind her. The tension lingered in the empty office. Ethan exhaled sharply, shaking his head before muttering to himself, Some people just don't know when to quit. Naomi stormed down the street, her fists clenched so tightly that her nails dug into her palms. She could still feel Ethan Reynolds' sneering voice echoing in her ears, his smirk as he ordered security to remove her, the humiliation of being dragged out like she didn't belong. She turned into an alley, away from the indifferent flow of the city, and leaned against the cold brick wall. Her breaths came in short, furious bursts as tears of frustration welled in her eyes. She hated that she felt this way, helpless, angry, and small. This is what they think of us, she spat aloud, her voice trembling with fury. Always a problem, always less than. No matter how hard we work, how much we prove, it's never enough. The tears spilled over, but they didn't cool the fire inside her. Instead, they burned, fueling her rage. She paced back and forth, her thoughts tumbling out in broken, angry fragments. All my life, every damn time, I've done everything right. I met their requirements, jumped through their hoops, played their stupid games, and it's still not enough. She slammed her fist into the wall, the pain in her hand a sharp counterpoint to the ache in her chest. Her voice rose, echoing in the narrow alley. Why does it always have to be like this? Why do we have to fight tooth and nail for things they hand out to everyone else without a second thought? She thought of the years she'd spent building her career, scraping by to make ends meet while pursuing her dream. She thought of the countless times she'd been overlooked, dismissed, or subtly undermined by people like Ethan Reynolds, people who looked at her and saw nothing but their own prejudices. Her voice dropped to a low, bitter mutter. They don't even hide it anymore. People like you, your type, they say it like we don't know exactly what they mean. The tears slowed, replaced by a simmering determination. She leaned back against the wall, tilting her head to the sky, her breath visible in the cool evening air. This isn't just him, she said quietly, her voice raw. "This is the whole damn system. They build it to keep us out, to keep us down, and they think we'll just take it." Naomi exhaled slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. Her anger hadn't subsided, but it had sharpened into something more focused. She pulled out her phone and stared at the blank screen for a moment before opening the camera. Her voice was steady as she hit record. "My name is Naomi Carter. Today, I walked into Horizon Insurance to apply for health insurance, and I was denied. Not because I didn't qualify, because I do. I was denied because I'm black." She paused, the weight of her words hanging in the air, before continuing. "The manager, Ethan Reynolds, made it clear. He called me a liability, said people like me abuse the system. He didn't even try to hide it." Her voice hardened, the fire in her eyes reflected in the screen. "I'm not going to let him get away with it. This is bigger than me. It's about every person who's been dismissed, disrespected, or outright denied because of the color of their skin. And I'm going to fight back." She ended the recording and stared at the screen for a long moment. Her reflection looked back at her, tired, angry, but unbroken. With a deep breath, she saved the video. Naomi pushed off the wall and stepped back onto the bustling street. The world moved on around her, oblivious to the battle raging in her mind. But she wasn't going to stay silent, not this time. As she walked home, the knot in her chest loosened slightly. The anger still burned, but now it was a weapon, not a burden. She wasn't sure what the next step would be, but she knew one thing for certain. Ethan Reynolds and Horizon Insurance weren't going to get away with this. The next morning, Naomi sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open, her phone buzzing with notifications. The video she had recorded the night before had taken on a life of its own. She'd shared it on her social media with the caption, "Discrimination in broad daylight. This is what we face every day." The post had been shared hundreds of times already, with comments pouring in, some supportive, others dismissive or outright hateful. "I can't believe this is still happening in 2024. Stay strong, sis. Typical race card nonsense. Fight back. Don't let them silence you." Naomi scrolled through the comments, her emotions swinging wildly between anger and gratitude. She clicked off the app and rubbed her temples, trying to center herself. Her best friend, Monica Hill, entered the apartment carrying 2 cups of coffee. "All right, I've got caffeine and a plan," Monica announced, setting the drinks down on the table. "First things first. How are you holding up?" Naomi exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing slightly at Monica's familiar presence. "Honestly, I'm exhausted. That video blew up overnight, and now it feels like everyone's watching me. I'm not sure I'm ready for this." Monica slid into the chair across from her. "You've been ready for this your whole life, Naomi. That video was powerful, and it's exactly what people needed to see. But we can't just leave it there. You need to take action." Naomi nodded slowly. "I know. I can't let him get away with what he said, what he did. But what's next? Filing a complaint? Getting a lawyer? It feels overwhelming." Monica leaned forward, her expression serious. "I've been doing some research. There's a lawyer, Darren Morgan. He's a civil rights bulldog, and he's taken down companies way bigger than Horizon Insurance. I think he's your guy." Naomi hesitated. "A lawyer? That feels big?" "Because it is," Monica said firmly. "This isn't just about you, Naomi. It's about everyone who's been denied, disrespected, or dismissed by people like Ethan Reynolds. You've got a chance to make a real change here." Naomi stared at her coffee cup, the steam curling lazily upward. The thought of taking on Horizon Insurance, a massive corporation with endless resources, felt daunting. But then she thought of Ethan's smug face, his condescending tone, the venom in his words. "You're right," she said finally, looking up at Monica. "I can't let this slide. I'll call him." Later that day, Naomi sat in Darren Morgan's office, the small space crowded with bookshelves overflowing with legal texts and folders. Darren, a tall man with a commanding presence, listened intently as Naomi recounted her experience at Horizon Insurance. When she finished, Darren leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his desk. Miss Carter, what you're describing isn't just a case of discrimination. It's systemic. Ethan Reynolds wasn't just speaking for himself. He was reflecting a corporate culture that tolerates, maybe even encourages, this kind of behavior. Naomi nodded, her resolve hardening. So, what can we do about it? Darren smiled faintly, his eyes glinting with determination. First, we file a formal complaint with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. That gets the ball rolling. Then we start gathering evidence. Your testimony, any documents from your application, any patterns of discrimination at Horizon. This is going to be a fight, but it's one we can win. Naomi leaned forward. I'm ready to do whatever it takes. I don't want anyone else to go through what I did. Good, Darren said, his tone decisive, because cases like these don't just change policies, they change lives. Ethan Reynolds and Horizon Insurance need to learn that this kind of behavior has consequences. That evening, Naomi walked home feeling a strange mix of anxiety and resolve. The fight ahead was daunting, but for the first time since her confrontation with Ethan, she felt like she had a real shot at justice. The anger from the day before still simmered beneath the surface, but now it was focused, transformed into fuel for the battle ahead. Naomi knew this wasn't just about her. It was about challenging a system that had failed so many for so long. As she stepped into her apartment, her phone buzzed. It was a notification from her social media post. Stay strong. We're behind you. Naomi smiled faintly, her fingers tightening around the phone. For the first time in a long while, she felt hopeful. Naomi sat across from Darren Morgan in his office a week later, the desk between them covered in documents. Darren had spread out her application, emails she'd exchanged with Horizon Insurance, and the transcription of her recorded account of the meeting with Ethan Reynolds. His pen tapped rhythmically against his legal pad as he considered their next steps. You've done well keeping everything organized, Darren said, glancing up at Naomi. This is solid groundwork. Now we need to dig deeper. What does that mean? Naomi asked, leaning forward, her fingers clasped tightly in her lap. It means uncovering patterns, Darren replied. Ethan Reynolds didn't just deny your application on a whim. His words and actions are a symptom of something larger. Systemic discrimination within Horizon Insurance. Naomi nodded. So, we're looking for other cases like mine? Exactly, Darren said. We're going to file a motion to subpoena Horizon's records. If they've denied coverage to other minority applicants under similar circumstances, it'll strengthen our case. But that's just one piece of the puzzle. We'll also need statements from former employees, whistleblowers, anyone who can corroborate what we already know. Naomi exhaled slowly. And how long is this going to take? Darren's expression softened slightly. Longer than either of us would like. Corporations like Horizon don't roll over easily. They'll fight tooth and nail to protect their image. But don't let that discourage you. Every step we take gets us closer to the truth. That evening, Naomi sat at her dining table, her laptop open to a blank email draft. Darren had suggested reaching out to anyone she might know who had dealt with Horizon Insurance. She hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She thought of the friends and acquaintances she'd met through freelance work, people who might have faced similar obstacles but hadn't spoken up. Finally, she began typing. Hi, I hope this email finds you well. I'm writing to ask if you've had any experiences with Horizon Insurance, specifically if you've been denied coverage unfairly. I'm currently working with a lawyer on a case against them and would appreciate any information or stories you're willing to share. Thank you for your time, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you'd like to discuss this further. Best, Naomi. She hit send and leaned back in her chair, her thoughts swirling. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about uncovering a pattern of injustice that had likely affected countless others. 2 days later, Darren called Naomi into his office. She arrived to find him sitting at his desk, a triumphant glint in his eye. We've got our first lead, he said, holding up a folder. A former Horizon employee contacted me. They worked under Ethan Reynolds and have some very interesting things to say. Naomi sat down, her heart racing. What kind of things? Discrimination, favoritism, deliberate targeting of minority applicants for denials, Darren said, opening the folder and glancing through his notes. It's worse than we thought. Ethan didn't just deny applications. He bragged about it to his colleagues. Naomi felt a surge of anger. He bragged? Darren nodded grimly. Apparently, he's been using phrases like cleaning up the applicant pool and weeding out liabilities for years. It's all been informal, off the record. But our contact is willing to testify. Naomi's hands gripped the edge of her chair. So this isn't just about me. This is his entire MO. Exactly, Darren said. And that's what makes this case so important. Ethan Reynolds isn't just a bad manager. He's a symptom of a larger problem at Horizon. If we can prove that his behavior was known and tolerated by upper management, we can take this case all the way to the top. Naomi nodded, her determination hardening. What's next? We prepare, Darren said. I'll file the subpoena for their records, and we'll start prepping our witness. But be ready. Horizon's legal team is going to come after you hard. They'll try to discredit you, paint you as emotional or vindictive. You need to stay calm and focused. Naomi met his gaze, her voice steady. I've come too far to back down now. That night, Naomi sat on her couch, scrolling through her email inbox. A few responses to her message had trickled in, most of them supportive, but hesitant to share personal details. Then, one subject line caught her eye. Horizon Insurance Denial Story. Happy to help. Her heart raced as she opened the email. It was from a woman named Angela who had faced a similar situation. A perfectly qualified application denied for vague policy reasons. Angela wrote about the frustration and humiliation she'd felt and expressed her willingness to share her story if it would help Naomi's case. Naomi leaned back, her eyes closing briefly as relief washed over her. She wasn't alone in this fight. By the end of the week, Darren had compiled a growing list of witnesses and evidence. Each new detail strengthened their case, painting a picture of a deeply flawed and discriminatory system. Naomi felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders, but it was accompanied by a growing sense of purpose. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for every person who'd been dismissed, denied, or devalued by people like Ethan Reynolds. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Naomi sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her social media feed. The initial wave of support from her video had been uplifting, but now the comments had shifted. Mixed among the supportive messages were a growing number of hateful and dismissive remarks. She's just looking for a payout. These cases never go anywhere. Just drop it, lady. Maybe if she wasn't so aggressive, they wouldn't have denied her. Her chest tightened as she read through the vitriol. She slammed her laptop shut, the sound echoing in the quiet apartment. Her phone buzzed, and she grabbed it, hoping for some good news. It was Darren. Hey, she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Naomi, I wanted to give you a heads up, Darren said, his tone cautious. Horizon's legal team is starting to push back. Hard. What do you mean? She asked, her stomach twisting. They've issued a public statement denying any wrongdoing, Darren explained. They claim your application was denied for valid reasons and that your accusations are baseless. Worse, they're starting to dig into your background. Naomi's grip tightened on her phone. Dig into my background? What does that even mean? They're looking for anything they can use to discredit you, Darren said. Old financial records, social media posts, anything that might paint you in a negative light. Naomi sat down, her mind racing. So they're trying to make me look like the problem, instead of addressing what they did. Exactly, Darren said. It's a classic tactic. Shift the focus, undermine the victim, and muddy the waters. But don't worry. We've anticipated this. Stay calm and stay focused. They're doing this because they know your case has teeth. Naomi nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I'm not backing down, Darren. They can dig all they want. They're not going to find anything. That's the spirit, Darren said, a note of encouragement in his voice. I'll keep you updated. In the meantime, try to ignore the noise. It's all part of their strategy to rattle you. The next morning, Naomi woke to an email from Monica with the subject line, "Have you seen this?" Her heart sank as she opened the link. It was an article from a gossip-style news site, filled with half-truths and insinuations. The headline read, "Insurance Denial Case. Is Naomi Carter really a victim?" The article dredged up irrelevant details about her finances, questioning her ability to pay premiums despite her proof of income. It painted her as someone looking for attention and playing the race card to cover up her shortcomings. Naomi slammed her laptop shut and buried her face in her hands. Her anger burned hot and fast, but underneath it was a creeping sense of vulnerability. Her phone rang, and she answered without checking the caller ID. "Naomi, it's Monica," her friend said, her voice urgent. "I just saw the article. Don't let it get to you. It's garbage, and everyone can see that." "Can they?" Naomi asked, her voice trembling. "Because it feels like they're winning. They're twisting everything, making it look like I'm the problem." "They're desperate," Monica said firmly. "That's all this is. They're throwing everything they can at you because they know they can't defend what they did. Don't let them shake you." Naomi took a deep breath. "You're right. I just didn't think it would get this ugly." Monica's voice softened. "I know, but you've got this, Naomi. You've got Darren. You've got evidence, and you've got a whole lot of people who believe in you. Don't forget that." At Darren's office later that day, Naomi sat across from him as he reviewed the latest developments. "We knew they'd play dirty," he said, sliding the gossip article across the desk. "But this is just the beginning. They're trying to intimidate you, hoping you'll back down." "Well, it's not going to work," Naomi said, her voice steely. "Let them throw whatever they want at me. I'm not quitting." Darren nodded approvingly. "Good, because we just got the court's approval for our subpoena. Horizon's internal records are officially on the table." Naomi's eyes widened. "You mean we're going to see everything? The denials? The patterns? That's the idea," Darren said. "If there's a paper trail, and I'm betting there is, we'll find it. And when we do, it'll blow their defense out of the water." Naomi felt a flicker of hope amidst the chaos. "So, what's next?" "Next, we prepare for their counterattack," Darren said. "They'll try to block the subpoena, delay the process, anything to keep us from getting those records. But we'll be ready." Naomi leaned back in her chair, her resolve hardening. "Let them try. I've already lost too much to stop now." As she walked home that evening, Naomi noticed the small but steady stream of messages still coming in from supporters. "Don't give up. You're fighting for all of us. Proud of you for standing up." Each message reminded her that this wasn't just her fight. It was bigger than her, bigger than Ethan Reynolds, even bigger than Horizon Insurance. And she wasn't going to let them win. Meanwhile, in his corner office at Horizon Insurance, Ethan Reynolds sat behind his desk, scowling as he read through the latest developments. The subpoena had hit harder than he expected, and now he was facing questions from upper management. "They're all overreacting," he muttered under his breath, tossing the latest email onto his desk. "One loudmouth gets denied, and suddenly it's a scandal. Typical." He leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a sneer. "She thinks she's so special. Just another entitled liability looking for a handout. They always play the same game. Cry discrimination when things don't go their way." Ethan drummed his fingers on the desk, a cruel satisfaction flickering in his eyes. "She's not the first to pull this stunt, and she won't be the last, but they never win. Horizon is untouchable, and so am I." The thought of Naomi's determined face flashed in his mind, and he scoffed. "Let her run her little crusade. She'll run out of steam when she realizes nobody cares about her sob story." He turned back to his computer, opening another document detailing Horizon's legal strategy. The corners of his mouth twitched upward. "And when we're done with her, she'll regret ever stepping into my office." Later that day, Naomi and Darren sat across from one of Horizon's former employees, Angela Davis, who had agreed to testify. Angela, a middle-aged woman with a firm but weary demeanor, recounted her time working under Ethan Reynolds. "He was ruthless," Angela said, her voice steady. He made it clear that minority applicants were seen as liabilities. If their applications came across his desk, he'd stamp denied without even reading them. Naomi clenched her fists under the table, her anger simmering. And no one said anything? No one stopped him? Angela shook her head. If anyone tried, they'd be out the door faster than they could pack up their desk. He had upper management's blessing to run things his way. It was an open secret. Darren leaned forward. Angela, would you be willing to testify to this in court? Angela hesitated for a moment before nodding. Yes, people need to know what kind of man he is, and what kind of company Horizon really is. Naomi reached across the table, her voice soft but firm. Thank you. I know this isn't easy, but it means everything to me, and to so many others. Angela smiled faintly. You're brave to stand up to them. Don't let them intimidate you. As Naomi walked home that evening, her mind raced with everything they'd uncovered. The evidence was piling up, and the case was growing stronger by the day. But so was the resistance from Horizon. The fight wasn't over yet, but Naomi felt the fire in her chest burning brighter. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone Ethan Reynolds and Horizon Insurance had ever dismissed, disrespected, or denied. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. Naomi stood in the courthouse hallway, clutching her notebook tightly. Darren paced beside her, scrolling through notes on his tablet. The day had arrived for the pre-trial hearing, and the air was thick with tension. Horizon Insurance's legal team was notorious for their aggressive tactics, and Naomi knew this would be a pivotal moment. Are you ready? Darren asked, pausing to look at her. Naomi nodded, her resolve firm. I've come this far. I'm not backing down now. Darren gave her a small, reassuring smile. Good. Remember, they're going to try to rattle you. Stay calm, answer honestly, and don't let them twist your words. Naomi exhaled slowly, steadying herself as the doors to the courtroom opened. Inside, Horizon's legal team was already seated. A group of impeccably dressed lawyers with a mountain of files stacked before them. At the head of the table sat Ethan Reynolds, his expression cold and impassive. Naomi felt a flicker of anger, but forced herself to focus. The hearing began with Horizon's lawyers arguing to dismiss the subpoena for their internal records. Their lead attorney, a sharp-tongued man named Richard Haynes, stood and addressed the judge with calculated confidence. Your Honor, this subpoena is nothing more than a fishing expedition, Haynes said, his voice smooth and authoritative. The plaintiff has provided no concrete evidence to suggest systemic wrongdoing on the part of Horizon Insurance. Allowing this request would set a dangerous precedent. Darren stood in response, his tone calm but firm. Your Honor, the evidence we've already presented shows a clear pattern of discriminatory practices within Horizon Insurance. This subpoena is not a fishing expedition. It's a necessary step to uncover the full extent of the defendant's misconduct. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp gaze, studied the documents before her. Mr. Haynes, the plaintiff has provided sufficient preliminary evidence to justify further investigation. The subpoena stands. Naomi felt a surge of relief as the judge's decision landed, but it was short-lived. Ethan leaned over to whisper something to Haynes, whose smirk grew wider as he rose to his feet again. Your Honor, while we respect the court's decision, we would also like to submit new evidence regarding the plaintiff's credibility, Haynes said, his tone laced with feigned professionalism. Naomi's stomach dropped. Haynes gestured to a folder handed to him by one of his associates. We have reason to believe that Ms. Carter has a history of financial instability that calls into question her ability to meet the obligations of any insurance policy. Furthermore, we've uncovered social media posts suggesting a pattern of behavior inconsistent with her claims. Darren immediately stood, his voice sharp. Objection, Your Honor. This is a blatant attempt to smear my client's character. The plaintiff's financial history and social media activity are irrelevant to the case at hand. The judge raised a hand to silence them. I'll allow the defense to present their evidence, but I remind both parties to keep this hearing focused on the issues of discrimination and denial of coverage. As the defense laid out their so-called evidence, Naomi felt her anger simmering beneath the surface. The financial records were cherry-picked to paint her as irresponsible, and the social media posts, light-hearted comments, and out-of-context photos were twisted to suggest she lacked seriousness or credibility. When Darren cross-examined Haynes, he tore through the defense's arguments with precision. "Mr. Haynes, are you suggesting that a person's ability to pay premiums is determined by their personal sense of humor?" he asked, holding up one of Naomi's social media posts. Haynes faltered, but quickly recovered. "Of course not, but it speaks to character." "Character," Darren repeated, his voice cutting. "Let's talk about character. Is it true that Horizon Insurance has denied coverage to a disproportionately high number of minority applicants?" Haynes bristled. "We deny coverage based on legitimate criteria, not race." Darren stepped closer, his voice rising slightly. "Then explain the term demographic concerns in your internal documents, or the policies flagged for denial based on zip codes predominantly populated by minorities. Is that legitimate criteria? Or discrimination in disguise?" The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Haynes struggled to respond. As the hearing concluded, Naomi stepped outside, the cool breeze brushing her face. Darren joined her, his expression one of cautious optimism. "They're on the defensive," he said. "They wouldn't be pulling stunts like that if they weren't worried." Naomi nodded, her thoughts racing. "But it's not over yet. They're still trying to discredit me, and we're not going to let them," Darren said firmly. The subpoena was a major win. Once we have those records, their entire defense will crumble. Naomi stared out at the city, her resolve hardening once more. "Good, because they're not just going to pay for what they did to me. They're going to pay for all of it. The lies, the denials, the discrimination." Darren smiled faintly. "That's the spirit. We'll keep pushing, and when we get to trial, they won't know what hit them." Naomi's hands trembled slightly as she held the thick packet of documents Darren had delivered that morning. These were the internal records Horizon Insurance had been forced to turn over, and each page was a damning indictment of their discriminatory practices. She sat in Darren's office as he methodically reviewed the documents. His usual calm demeanor was tinged with an edge of satisfaction as he laid out the evidence piece by piece. "This," Darren said, holding up a memo marked confidential, "is the nail in their coffin." Naomi leaned forward, her eyes scanning the page. The memo, written by a high-ranking Horizon executive, detailed the company's risk assessment protocols. The language was thinly veiled but unmistakable. Minority applicants were to be flagged for additional scrutiny and often denied coverage outright. "They didn't even bother to hide it," Naomi said, her voice a mix of anger and disbelief. "This memo spells out exactly what they've been doing." Darren nodded. "And look at this." He flipped to another document, a report showing denial rates broken down by demographics. The statistics were damning. Minority applicants were denied at 3 times the rate of white applicants, even when their qualifications were identical. Naomi's chest tightened as she read the report. How did they get away with this for so long? "They buried it," Darren replied, his tone grim. "And they relied on people like Ethan Reynolds to enforce these policies without question. But now, it's all coming to light." The tension continued to build as Horizon's legal team ramped up their efforts to discredit Naomi. Another article appeared online, this time accusing her of seeking a political agenda rather than justice. Trolls flooded her social media with hateful comments, accusing her of lying, exaggerating, and playing the victim. Monica called one evening, her voice laced with concern. "Naomi, are you okay? The things they're saying about you—" "I'm fine," Naomi interrupted, though her voice betrayed her weariness. "Let them talk. I'm not going to let their lies distract me." Monica sighed. "You're stronger than I am. Just know I'm here for you." "Okay, thanks, Monica," Naomi said, her voice softening. "I'll be fine. I have to be." But when the call ended, Naomi sat in the darkened room, the weight of the fight pressing down on her. She clenched her fists, the fire in her chest flickering but not extinguished. "They think they can break me," she whispered to herself. But they have no idea who they're dealing with. A few days later, Naomi and Darren sat in a packed courtroom for another pre-trial hearing. Horizon's legal team had filed a motion to dismiss key pieces of evidence, arguing that the documents obtained through the subpoena were misinterpreted and irrelevant. Horizon's lead attorney, Richard Haynes, stood before the judge, his tone polished but insincere. "Your Honor, these documents have been taken out of context. They reflect standard business practices, not discriminatory intent." Darren rose to counter, his voice steady and commanding. "Your Honor, the documents clearly outline a pattern of discrimination against minority applicants. This isn't a matter of misinterpretation. It's a matter of systemic bias, plain and simple." The judge, her expression unreadable, listened intently as Darren laid out his argument. He highlighted specific sections of the memos and reports, showing how they directly supported Naomi's claims. When he finished, the judge glanced at the defense. "Mr. Haynes, your argument to dismiss this evidence lacks merit. The motion is denied." A wave of relief washed over Naomi, but she caught the venomous glare Ethan Reynolds shot her from across the room. It was a look of pure hatred, a silent promise that he wasn't done fighting. As the trial date loomed closer, Horizon began to feel the pressure. Whistleblowers came forward, corroborating Naomi's claims and painting an even bleaker picture of the company's practices. Public opinion started to shift, with major news outlets picking up the story and amplifying Naomi's voice. Darren met Naomi in his office, a rare smile on his face. "They've just offered a settlement," he said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. Naomi glanced at the figure, a substantial amount, enough to make her pause. But she shook her head, her resolve unwavering. "I'm not taking it." Darren nodded, as though he'd expected her answer. "Good, because this case isn't about the money. It's about holding them accountable. And that's exactly what we're going to do," Naomi said, her voice firm. That evening, Naomi sat in her apartment, reviewing her notes for the upcoming trial. She thought of everything she'd been through: the humiliation, the smear campaigns, the endless fight to be heard. But she also thought of the people who had reached out to her, the former employees and denied applicants who had shared their stories. She thought of Angela, who had risked everything to testify. "This isn't just my fight," Naomi whispered to herself. "This is for all of us." She closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair, her eyes burning with determination. The climax of her battle was approaching, and she was ready to face it head-on. Naomi sat at the plaintiff's table in the packed courtroom, her heart pounding as the judge called the court to order. The room buzzed with tension, reporters packed along the back wall, cameras clicking as the high-profile case began. She glanced at Darren Morgan, her attorney, who gave her a reassuring nod. Across the aisle, Ethan Reynolds sat stiffly at the defense table, his posture rigid and his expression carefully neutral. Naomi noticed the slight twitch in his jaw and the way his fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, a crack in his otherwise polished demeanor. The judge's gavel struck, silencing the murmurs in the gallery. "Ladies and gentlemen, this court is now in session. The case of Naomi Carter versus Horizon Insurance and Ethan Reynolds will proceed." Darren rose, his voice calm yet commanding as he addressed the jury. "This case is not about business practices. It's about discrimination. Discrimination that targeted my client, Naomi Carter, not because of her qualifications or her circumstances, but because of her race. Today, we will show you the evidence that proves Horizon Insurance, under the direction of Ethan Reynolds, systematically denied coverage to minority applicants. This case is about accountability, and justice demands it." Naomi watched the jury's faces, noting the way their eyes focused on Darren, their expressions thoughtful. The defense attorney, Richard Haynes, rose next, his tone polished and measured. "Ladies and gentlemen, the plaintiff will try to convince you that this is a case of discrimination, but the evidence will show otherwise. Horizon Insurance evaluates applications based on objective criteria: income, medical history, risk factors. Mrs. Carter's application simply did not meet those criteria. There was no bias, no discrimination, just due diligence. Naomi felt her stomach tighten. She knew their strategy: twist the narrative, paint her as unreasonable, and minimize the evidence. The trial began with Darren calling Angela Davis, a former Horizon Insurance employee, to the stand. Angela, a middle-aged woman with a firm yet weary demeanor, recounted her experience working under Ethan Reynolds. He made it clear: minority applicants were flagged as high risk, regardless of their qualifications. He used terms like weeding out liabilities and cleaning up the applicant pool. It was common knowledge among the staff. Haynes attempted to discredit Angela during cross-examination, suggesting she was a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. But Darren's redirect was sharp and precise, emphasizing Angela's credibility and the corroboration of her testimony with internal documents. Next, Darren presented the damning memos and spreadsheets obtained through the subpoena. The documents outlined a systematic process of flagging minority applicants under vague terms like demographic concerns and zip code risk factors. Naomi watched as the jury's expressions shifted: shock, disgust, and disbelief flickering across their faces. Darren's voice rang out as he addressed the jury directly. These documents are not about due diligence. They are about systemic racism, cloaked in bureaucratic language. This is not how a fair and equitable business operates. Naomi took the stand next, her heart pounding as she raised her hand to take the oath. She recounted her meeting with Ethan Reynolds, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions churning within her. "He dismissed me before I even had a chance," she said. "He called me a liability and said people like me abuse the system. It was clear that he wasn't judging my application. He was judging me." Haynes's cross-examination was sharp and invasive. He brought up her financial history, attempting to paint her as irresponsible. "Ms. Carter," Haynes said, his tone dripping with skepticism, "would you say your financial situation was entirely stable at the time of your application?" "My financial records show that I met the income requirements," Naomi replied firmly. "My stability wasn't in question. Only Ethan Reynolds's bias was." Haynes shifted tactics, bringing up her social media posts. "Would you say these posts reflect the professionalism of someone seeking an insurance policy?" Naomi met his gaze without flinching. "My social media posts have nothing to do with my qualifications for health insurance. This is about discrimination, not my personal life." After days of testimony, Darren stood for his closing argument, his voice filled with quiet intensity. "This case is about power. The power to decide who gets access to basic human rights like health care and who doesn't. Horizon Insurance and Ethan Reynolds abused that power to discriminate against Naomi Carter. But today, you have the power to send a message that no one, no matter how powerful, is above the law." Haynes countered with polished deflections, arguing that the evidence was circumstantial and that the denial of Naomi's application was based on objective factors. But as the jury filed out to deliberate, Naomi felt a glimmer of hope. Darren had laid out the truth, and now it was up to the jury to see it. Naomi sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands gripping the edges as the jury filed back into the courtroom. The air was electric, the tension so thick it felt like it could snap at any moment. Across the aisle, Ethan Reynolds sat with his arms crossed, his face set in a stony mask. The judge addressed the jury foreperson. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor," the foreperson said, standing and unfolding a piece of paper. Naomi's breath hitched as she glanced at Darren, who gave her a small nod of reassurance. She braced herself. "In the case of Naomi Carter versus Horizon Insurance and Ethan Reynolds, we find in favor of the plaintiff," the foreperson began, her voice steady. "We award the plaintiff $3 million in damages, consisting of $2 million in punitive damages for discriminatory practices and $1 million in compensatory damages for emotional distress." The numbers struck like a lightning bolt. Gasps rippled through the courtroom, and Naomi felt a wave of relief crash over her. Tears welled in her eyes as the enormity of the verdict sank in. Darren placed a firm hand on her shoulder, his smile small but triumphant. "We did it," Naomi whispered, her voice trembling. "No," Darren replied, his tone filled with quiet pride. "You did it." Across the room, Ethan Reynolds sat frozen, his face pale and his lips pressed into a thin line. $3 million. The number hung in the air, and for the first time, his composure cracked. His lawyer leaned in to speak, but Ethan waved him off, his gaze locked on Naomi. "She thinks this makes her a hero," he thought bitterly. "She got her payout, but this won't last. People like her always come crashing down eventually." But as he glanced at the jury, now standing to leave, and the reporters scribbling furiously, a sinking feeling set in. This wasn't just about money. This was about his reputation, his career. Later that day, as the courthouse emptied, Naomi stood outside, surrounded by a sea of supporters and flashing cameras. She gave a brief statement, her voice clear and determined. "This verdict isn't just for me," she said. "It's for everyone who has been dismissed, disrespected, and discriminated against. This is proof that no one is untouchable, no matter how much power they think they have. Change is possible, and today is only the beginning." Nearby, Ethan Reynolds shoved through the crowd, his jaw clenched as reporters shouted questions at him. "Mr. Reynolds, how do you respond to the verdict? What's next for you at Horizon Insurance?" Ethan ignored them, heading straight for his waiting car. Inside, he slammed the door, his fists pounding the steering wheel. The fallout came quickly. Within hours, the verdict dominated the headlines. $3 million verdict in discrimination case rocks Horizon Insurance. Racist practices exposed. Naomi Carter's landmark victory. By the next morning, Horizon Insurance's board of directors convened an emergency meeting. Public backlash was swift and unforgiving, with customers threatening boycotts and advocacy groups demanding accountability. "Ethan Reynolds is a liability," one board member said, her voice sharp. "We can't afford to keep him on payroll." The decision was unanimous. Ethan Reynolds was fired that same afternoon, escorted out of the building by security with a single box of his belongings. As he walked to his car, head down to avoid the jeering crowd outside, his mind churned with bitterness and denial. "This is ridiculous," he muttered under his breath. "One verdict, and they throw me under the bus, after everything I've done for this company." He stopped at the driver's side door, gripping the box so tightly his knuckles turned white. "They'll regret this. She'll regret this. None of this is over." But deep down, he felt the sting of humiliation. His career was in ruins, his name synonymous with discrimination and failure. For the first time, the weight of his actions began to press on him, though he quickly buried the thought beneath a wave of resentment. Naomi learned of Ethan's firing later that day through an article online. The headline read, "Horizon Insurance fires Ethan Reynolds following discrimination case fallout." A smile tugged at her lips as she read the details. It wasn't just about the money. This was about accountability. For so long, people like Ethan had wielded their power unchecked, hurting others without consequence. Now, he was finally facing the reality of his actions. Monica called a few minutes later, practically shouting through the phone. "Did you see? They fired him. That racist jerk is out." Naomi laughed, the sound light and free. "I saw. It's a start." "A start?" Monica said. "Girl, you've taken down a whole system. You should be celebrating." "I am," Naomi replied, glancing at her laptop, where messages of support continued to pour in. "But there's still so much work to do." As the days passed, the impact of the trial rippled outward. Naomi received messages from people all over the country, sharing their own stories of discrimination and thanking her for standing up. She responded to as many as she could, offering encouragement and hope. Sitting at her desk one evening, she drafted a post for her social media. "This verdict isn't the end. It's a beginning. To everyone who's been silenced or ignored, know this. Your voice matters. Your fight matters. Together, we can change the system, one step at a time." As she hit post, Naomi leaned back in her chair, a quiet sense of satisfaction settling over her. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt the weight of victory.